Okay, hello, welcome everyone to today's session of Narrating Difference Research Forum. Today we have a different kind of session where we'll be discussing a book, and we have Satish, the author of the book Counterpoints in Fractal Modernities, Essays in Plural Postcolonialities, and Chinmay will be facilitating the discussion with us here. So before we begin, I would just like to give a brief background of our forum. This forum was started by the students of the Department of Comparative Literature and India Studies at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. Since its inception in 2018, we have been organizing sessions regularly, mostly in online format. The student-led initiative provides an academic space for dialogue, exchange, and critical reflection, bringing together scholars from diverse disciplines and research interests. This research forum, which is now named Narrating Difference, continues to strive in its efforts to invite and host people across disciplines, borders, and perspectives. To facilitate this, we also have a mailing list where you can sign up to get regular updates about the sessions that we conduct. You may also write to us if you want to present your work or ideas on our platform. I'll be sharing the link in the chat box very soon. I would also like to mention that this meeting is being recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So I think I'll introduce Chinmay first, who is going to tell us about his reading of the book, since he has written a review for this, and he can then introduce the book to us, and then Satish will take us through it later, and then we can all join in the conversation. So I'll introduce Chinmay, who is currently pursuing his PhD in comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, prior to which he taught literature and media studies to undergraduate students at the Department of Communication Studies at Mount Carmel College, Bangalore, India. Chinmay is currently interested in the relationship between religion and literary form and philosophical questions concerning the self, language, and experience. He speaks Marathi, Kannada, Hindi, and English. So over to you, Chinmay.
Thank you so much, Shachi. Thanks a lot. Am I audible to everyone? Okay. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to this book discussion. It is a real pleasure and privilege to be here in conversation with Satish today, and I'm very grateful to everyone else who has joined for this discussion. I thought I would begin briefly by sharing my own reading of the book, what I took from the book, what I found generative, and what I think it offers to those of us interested in comparative literature, post-colonial studies, Indian literary cultures, and the subtending implications of literary studies, which for me is the ethics of reading. The central argument of the book, that post-coloniality cannot be thought in the singular, is extremely important, not just to be said as a slogan, which I find myself saying many times in classrooms and conversations, but especially to be read into the objects of our study. Post-colonial realities are plural, layered, and often internally incommensurable. This is why the subtitle of this book, Essays in Plural Postcolonialities, is also so important. The plural is the methodological heart of this book. I say that because the four essays, again functioning in the attributive adjective, which we know as plural, incommensurabilities, continuities, historiographies, counterpoints, each take up a different problem. But I think that they are held together by a larger concern, which is the question of what kind of comparative practice becomes possible when one begins not from similarity, but from plurality itself. The first essay was particularly striking to me because it takes up the category of modern Indian theatre and asks and questions categories such as Indian, modern, and theatre, especially when they're too quickly assumed to be self-evident. Satish revisits this long-standing search for the quote-unquote roots of Indian theatre to show that such searches themselves are not innocent. They can be animated by decolonial desires, and at the same time, in that decolonial desire, they can also be entangled with Sanskritic and Brahminical projects of cultural consolidation. So the desire to recover indigenous traditions is not automatically emancipatory. And I think this is one of the problems of decolonial practices in modern Indian politics, or many times in the global South or the third world, or whatever we understand by that is, or whatever we understand that is meant by these terms. It can become, as in decolonial practice can become and has become in some spaces, assimilative, exclusionary, and homogenizing. And decolonial practice will then have to deal with the notions of glorious pasts and inevitable futures. One of the strong interventions in this essay for me is Satish's distinction between performance and ritual. Performance can often be understood within a representational frame. That is, the word re-present indicates the re of the present. In other words, I understand this as the happening again, the re of presence itself. Ritual, however, cannot be representational, Satish shows, because it is an act of presence itself. And because this is so, it cannot be easily assimilated into theoretical frames, specifically because theoretical frames usually presuppose an interpretation of representation. And this difficulty, Satish suggests, reveals some inadequacies of certain conventional post-colonial frameworks themselves. So the issue here is not that Indian modernity is somehow theoretically deficient, but rather the issue is that the frames through which we understand it are sometimes too narrow. And the essay has sort of taught me to pause and question this. Another important lesson for me from the second essay, Continuities, is the danger of retroactive interpretation. And this is an essay where Satish stages multiple readings of Bhakti and Sufi poetry, especially the problem of expressing divine love, the ineffable, or the experience of radical alterity. Instead of reading these traditions through later categories such as proto-feminist, proto-modern, or proto-progressive, it might be important to first ask, what do we do to a text when we impose upon it a vocabulary that has emerged much later? Of course, history or the past is always read in the present, but the point is to pause at that moment of reading history and ask this question. And there's a formulation in the book that I found especially useful to describe this move, where Satish writes that one may retroactively ascribe value to the past, but one cannot retroactively prescribe meaning to it. Moving on, I found another extremely compelling argument in the historiography's essay, where he was drawing from Shishir Kumar Das's idea, where they were drawing from Shishir Kumar Das's idea of phase lag, Nabanita Dev Sen's formulation of Indian experiential reality as a simultaneous cohabitation of the ancient, medieval, and ultra-modern. And in such an experiential reality, a single temporal signifier proves to be inadequate to accommodate this sort of dynamism. So, because different languages, regions, genres, and institutions encounter what is termed as colonial or even post-colonial modernity differently, some were exposed to it earlier, some later. So the category of modern Indian theatre is not a simple category. It is purposive, and we must ask what objective this purposiveness serves, and if that helps us as comparatists or not. They then read Mariama Ba, Kuratulain Haidar, Bama, and Chimamanda Adichie together, not because they have some sort of a comparable ground. In fact, the point in that essay, the final one, which is Counterpoints, was not to establish thematic equivalence between different texts. The point was to create a contrapunctal dialogue across different locations, languages, histories, and gendered experiences. What I found especially useful here is their distinction between the symptom and sign when we are doing literary study. So systems such as patriarchy and misogyny often produce material symptoms like suffering, exclusion, violence, etc. But literature gives us the signs of the system and not the system itself. That is to say, literature gives us forms, voices, narrative structures, figures, and maybe even silences. So the comparatist cannot ignore material conditions, but the comparatist cannot also treat literature as mere sociological evidence. The literary text must then be read as a relation of form and content, as mediation, as response. This is a very valuable reminder for me, especially in politically engaged criticism, because we cannot reduce text to their politics, but neither can we detach textuality from the structures that make expression itself possible. So the figures they discuss in this essay, women marked as bad wives, unfit mothers, rebellious daughters, do not produce a single model of post-colonial femininity. Instead, gendered figurations are shown to be produced differently across social locations. So in such a move, comparison is not classification. It's not the arrangements of text under shared themes, and therefore definitely not the production of sameness. At its best, comparison is an ethical practice of reading across difference without domesticating that difference. So towards the end, they suggest that we inhabit comparative lives, that our being in the world is already relational, already intersubjective, and always already within the reach of the many others who are also within the reach of us as well. So I'm now very happy to introduce the author of this book, S. Satish Kumar. When I asked Satish what bio I should use for this introduction, they very quickly and rather slyly said, say whatever you want. You know me now. So let me begin then on a more personal note of gratitude. They have been helping me think through some of my current academic projects and also through other questions of life and academia more generally. And in doing so, they've been a patient listener, a very generous interlocutor, and a wonderful source for all things academic. They completed their PhD in comparative and intercultural studies at the University of Georgia in Athens, USA. They have also served there as a part-time instructor with both the Institute of African American Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature and Intercultural Studies at Georgia, contributing to teaching and curriculum that foregrounded questions of race, power, empire, and global equity. With that, I am very happy to invite Satish to respond to my reading and to speak about the book and the larger intellectual questions that animate it. And if I were, I mean, it's up to you, but if we were to go with our format, then maybe the idea of phase lag, Navanithan Dev says, coexistence of multiple temporalities, what is described as the simultaneous presence of the ancient, medieval, ultra-modern. What does this do to, literary historiography? Maybe you want to start with that or anything else. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Let me begin by thanking Narrating Difference for having me today. I've been following their work very closely for the past few years now, and I've been attending their sessions, and you guys have been doing such phenomenal work when it comes to comparative literature and a practice of comparative literature in India, and I really think that's so wonderful, and especially just keeping it on this sort of accessible level where we are talking across different subject positions. It's not just people coming and talking at other people, but this space for dialogue, the space for conversation is something that is truly wonderful and beautiful. And thank you, Chinmay, for that very kind and generous reading and introduction. And yeah, I mean, not that this was at all rehearsed, but at this point, I'm going to read a section from the introduction, as I was absolutely not asked to do. And maybe later on, I will read a section from the conclusion again, as I was absolutely not asked to do. So I will do this of my own volition. But this kind of ties to that quote that I kind of use as a sort of refrain across the various essays that keeps coming back, and that's exactly what Chinmay referenced. So I'll start with the quote, and then just read a little bit from the introduction, and then we can proceed further. This event, as is a sort of conversation. So Chinmay and I will be going back and forth. So I'll start by reading from the introduction, and this is from page 27 of both the PDF and the physical copy, as we've now established.
Yeah. Thank God for that.
Yeah. Thank God for Adobe, also overcharging us for subscriptions, but never mind. I never said that. Okay, so this is the quote from Nabanita Devshen's essay. We live with the ancient, medieval, and the ultra-modern all within reach of one another. Value-wise, in an urban, middle-class, ordinary family, often the medium-educated father belongs to the 19th century, the uneducated mother and the domestic help to the medieval world, and the Hollywood-educated son is a 21st century specimen. Amid such contradictory forces all working at once, where the formidable time lag is not of generations but of centuries, it may not seem easy to find a common denominator in literature. Now, this essay was first, I think, it first appeared in the late 1970s, 1977, if I'm not mistaken, and then was republished in her collection called Counterpoints, to which, of course, my book is also an homage. So I'll read further from my sort of reflection on this particular passage. I remember coming across this passage when I first read The Concept of Indian Literature Today as a 20-year-old undergraduate student in comparative literature at Jadavpur University. I recall being immediately struck by how relatable it seemed at the time. While the circumstances of my upbringing were somewhat different, inasmuch as following the passing of my grandfather when I was around 11 years old, I was raised in a household of women, all of whom, except for my grandmother, were school teachers. However, it resonated very closely with the context in which my mother and my four aunts were raised. I have faint recollections of some of the letters my grandfather would type up on his olive green Imperial Company typewriter or handwrite in an impeccable cursive penmanship using a fine iridium-tipped wing-sung fountain pen. The register of English he used in his official correspondences, including letters to my primary school teachers, seems to resemble letters housed and displayed in museums of colonial history. My grandmother, who, as many women in rural India at the time, could not complete her secondary education, was literate in Tamil, Malayalam, and English. She was an avid reader of newspapers and magazines and could also recite prayers and passages of scripture from memory. My mother and aunts received a convent school English medium education and went on to earn college degrees. As part of their curriculum through school, college, and university, they were read widely across 19th and early 20th century British and American literatures. However, besides this, they were also exposed to a vast array of more contemporary British, American, and Indian or South Asian popular culture through the radio, television, and cinema. They listened to the music of ABBA, Baccara, Boney M, Simon and Garfunkel, alongside popular Hindi film songs, and the then Pakistani pop music sensations Nazia and Zohaib Hassan, while reading Mills and Boon romances and Daniel Steele novels. The latter, of course, meticulously covered in old newspapers to conceal their somewhat racy book covers. Thinking about an experience of time in such contrapuntal ways opens a potential lexicon for understanding the realities of inhabiting multiple temporalities at once. As Devsen demonstrates with her example of a typical mid-20th century urban middle-class Indian family, which I further sought to supplement with my example of my own family, each individual experiential locus in these households is framed by overlapping temporal registers. Growing up in such a household, the antiquated English of my grandfather's letters, the prayers my grandmother would recite from memory, and the songs of ABBA and Boney M were just as much a part of my formative years as Shah Rukh Khan movies or the songs of Britney Spears. Each of these temporal registers then resonate in one's experiences contrapuntally, borrowing metaphorically from the use of the technique in musical compositions, where two melodies harmonize with one another while retaining their own unique rhythmic characteristics and movements. The moments of harmonization between melodic lines do not necessarily represent a resolution of one into the other. It is not one melody being subsumed by another. Rather, it is these moments of resonance, but equally dissonance as well, that lead to a mutual illumination of the contrapuntal musical registers. One can see how such contrapuntal modalities become an apt metaphor for the kinds of contexts and experiences I keep returning to across this book.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and a little later you also write that that this it will be impossible to quantify this hybridity, right? And we can't have like a quantifiable. It may be easy to locate these temporalities, that different temporalities for different people that affect us in different ways, but to quantify them, to get some sort of a analytic to understand national culture is just impossible. And to do so would then be to fall into the pitfall of uh, some sort of a colonial mindset, right? That we will be able to, in fact, quantify these temporalities, especially because it's completely affective. If that makes sense, yeah.
And I'm not saying that was perhaps the intention when we think about, a more conventional approach to post-colonial criticism or post-colonial theory. And I don't think that was what people were intending to say. But it definitely ends up becoming this sort of like, I don't know how many of us here are familiar with 2019 cartoons, but it's like the Powerpuff Girls being created in a laboratory where sugar, spice, everything nice and like measured out quantities, and then you put excess of chemical X into it. So in the sense that you can't quantify, when I say quantify, I mean that you can't specify that this much or this attribute is something that comes out of the impact of Western cultures, Western modernities mediated through colonial access, or what we think of as traditional or indigenous. The way in which these things come together in a sort of confluence, what the modern kind of become.
Satish, if I may interrupt here once.
Yeah, sorry.
I think Ikshita ma'am wants to say something that she can say once you complete, but ma'am, can you please put your mic on mute? There's a lot of disturbance coming. Yes, please continue.
Oh, I didn't notice. I'm sorry. So yeah, and so it's not like we think of colonial or post-colonial modernities as this sort of problematic love child between Western modernism and native indigeneity. So it's all of these things coming together, and I think it's also that logic of what Raymond Williams would call the dominant, residual, and emergent. And so there are different things that become more significant across different moments in time. I mean, I remember this from way back in my undergraduate days when Pratap Bandyopadhyay, who used to teach in our department at Jadavpur, and he used to come in to teach only like the Sanskrit portions of the curriculum. And I remember he was teaching the Mrichakatikam, and he would keep talking about the sort of elements of quotes of the modern in Shudraka's Nataka. And of course, I didn't quite understand it then, but then if we think about how different things that we now consider as modern, it becomes difficult to situate them as exclusively a product of quote Western influence or from something that is quote unquote indigenous.
Yeah, and just to bring back,
Ipshitadi wanted to say something.
No, we'll hear what Chinmay wants to bring back, because what I have to say is primarily to Chinmay only. But
I think I know what you want to say, but I was just
no, so then okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just sticking to the vocabulary in the book. So,
so okay, then in that case, the vocabulary in the book is also under question.
Yeah. No, but just to bring back, because we're talking multiple temporalities and phase lag, right? That whatever this the phenomenon that is termed as post-colonial modernity or colonial modernity also was temporally spaced out. And just to bring back what Damodar Mauzo said to us a couple of days ago, that Goa also, it took, I think, if I'm not wrong, December 1961 was when it was sort of won back in Operation Vijay. So 1947 isn't really the marker for that state or that region. So and that's something we'll have to take obviously into consideration. Empirically, that can be validated. So yeah.
No, and the idea of the phase lag, and that, of course, I mean, I'm referencing the work of Satish Kumar and the notion of the profane and the metaphane, the early appearance and the late appearance. And so, of course, even if we think of it in terms of what Mary Louise Pratt would call zones of contact, so there were zones of contact that had earlier access to colonial culture through or European, whatever we mean by that, European culture through colonially mediated access. So if we think about, the Bengal and the Madras presidencies, the access to colonial culture was, of course, earlier than other parts. So he's talking about how then, the impact or the influence and the reception of colonial culture then gets mediated also through these zones of early contact in zones of later contact. So, yeah.
Right. And I'm wondering now if we could move on to the next to the maybe the next point I wanted to talk about is that bit about ritual and performance.
Yeah.
Right. Where your distinction between ritual as presence and performance as representation raises a challenge. If ritual resists representation, then it will be very difficult to interpret or in that sense, right? So you talk about the untheorizable in the first essay, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So, and I, of course, consciously kind of stay away from the sort of, say, more, conventional understanding of ritual space and ritual time. Of course, there is that sense of, what we might call the event of hierophany in a ritual, where something quote unquote transcendental or something divine manifests in that moment. But I'm looking at it primarily as sort of clash in what I'm calling temporality, in the sense that there is this experience of time that through its representation or narrativization then becomes meaningful. And it's not even as much as saying that, the ritual performer, or in the case of the ritual, the performer or the performance is embodied, whereas, in other cases, it's representational. And because, I mean, every performance in that sense is embodied. I mean, there is a sort of, or at least on a very, very basic level, there is a connection to the body. Like, for example, if I'm singing a rag, if I'm singing a khayal, and I am bound within the structure of a tal, I'm bound within the structure of how many beats there are, and from where I start a sort of like, when I start a tan, which is the sort of like exploration into a sort of melodic concatenation of notes, I have a certain amount of space within which to accomplish that. I have a certain amount of breath in my lungs within which to also accomplish that. So I know when I need to breathe, when I need to stop. So in that sense, of course, all of this is embodied in that structural sort of sense. So when I'm thinking about ritual and theater, at least in this context, and I'm drawing a lot from G. Shankaram Pillai's work, is that there is a difference in purpose, there is a difference in meaning. So when we think about ritual performance in the context of theater, which is something that G. Shankaram Pillai is very, very critical of, he says when we take ritual and transplant it in the proscenium space, then all it does is it serves as a spectacle and nothing else. So it is that sort of illegibility or incommensurability that I'm kind of trying to tease out there. And it's really something that is unprecedented on both ends, in the sense that neither does the colonizer understand what is happening, and neither do the colonized understand what is happening. And which is why I draw on that example from Things Fall Apart, where nobody knows what to do now that an ancestral spirit has been killed, because nobody has any recollection of this ever having happened. And the only thing that you hear is this terrifying howl of the mother of spirits, and that's the only thing that one can do in a circumstance such as that, is to mourn. So the only thing we know is to grieve the loss of that spirit. But there's something at play there. Is what I feel when I read that there is. And there are, of course, several examples of incommensurability in Things Fall Apart. I mean, the most funny example is when the the, uh, the missionaries get a translator who's not very familiar with the dialect in that region, or the particular version of Igbo that's spoken in that region. And so he keeps translating the word soul literally. But in that region, that word that he's using in Igbo does not mean soul, but means buttons. And so, of course, nobody understands why these missionaries are so obsessed with saving people's buttons. So but that's not the kind of incommensurability that I'm also talking about. Of course, that's important, but there is something that defies this logic of meaning on both ends, because it is an unprecedented event, because something like this has never happened before. We really do not have the frames with which to understand it.
Thank you. Yeah. In your next essay, right, I was struck by the problem of a posteriori frames, and as I said earlier in our conversation, I was taken by your discussion of Mirabai and earlier Antigone, and your caution against retroactively imposing those certain contemporary categories on these texts. So I was just thinking that what does it mean to read with a text rather than over a text? And there is that line, if you want to read that, which we spoke about earlier, that if line or paragraph maybe.
Which one?
Well, if you go back in time and if you ask them.
So you know which one. So then you say it.
Wait, I'll have to pull it up. But until then, maybe you can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So, of course, I mean, there is a sort of located position from which we're reading, and in that sense, when we think about figures like Mirabai, or we think about figures like Antigone, or the more commonly kind of talked about, the relationship between the Pir and the Murid as being, homoerotic, homosocial, queer, and so on and so forth. Now, we also have to understand where these frames of reading are coming from. Of course, they are helping us understand something. But what I'm also trying to say, perhaps, is that maybe they don't exhaust the possibility of meaning that the text offers us. So, I mean, and again, as comparatists, particularly comparatists functioning outside of a Euro-American context, we have to bear this burden of the quote Eurocentrism of comparative literature as a discipline. Now, if we work our way back and think about where does comparative literature come from, why does comparative literature come up, and the usual examples we kind of come up with are, in response to, French cultural hegemony again under the Napoleonic era. We think in terms of a sort of democratization of the canon. Goethe talking about Weltliteratur as opposed to just national literature and so on and so forth. Now, this charge has always seemed absurd to me, because if historically this discipline is coming out of the quote-unquote crises in Europe, then of course it is Eurocentric. But nowhere does it say that that burden is ours to bear. We have our own burden to bear. And we can make this meaningful for us in our own ways as well. And so to read with a text, as you said, is to maybe also try and understand how we work with, of course, our own subjectivities, but also work with where the text is coming from and what it is trying to say. So, of course, there is this, and I was watching this interview with Ruth Vanida, which came out I think 10 days ago, where she's talking about how, we've all kind of grown up in an academy or a certain kind of mindset that makes us believe that unless we use theory, what we are saying is not intelligible or not intelligent in any way. So, in order to sound intelligent, in order to sound relevant or meaningful, we have to talk about theory. So, in that sense, that's sort of a bridging of this gap. Yes, of course, everything is patriarchal. That is a sort of inescapable totality. Everything was, is, and maybe even continues to be racist, continues to be misogynist, continues to be homophobic. And I'm not talking about not holding that literature or the literary text accountable for that. We're not giving people a pass because they were born before critical race theory was invented. But to understand that, one theoretical lens, any singular theoretical lens, does not exhaust the possibility of meaning that a text offers us. And to understand that these distinctions that we talk about, particularly in the context of Sufi poetry, or in the case of Bhakti poetry, where the sort of feminization of the poetic self or the poetic voice is considered to be a queering, I don't disagree with that. But this idea of queerness as something that is contradistinctive to straightness is a much later understanding. So so in our current understanding, something is homosexual in as much as it is not heterosexual. Now, I'm not saying that these distinctions did not exist, but maybe they did not exist discursively as the way they do now.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think this brings this is actually a really good way to segue into the next bit about symptom and sign, right? That as you suggest, identitarian modes of engagement often quickly move towards the issue, whereas the comparatist task is to attend to the sign, the forms of representation or not represent, but expression that are evident for us in the things that materially that we perceive as text, as object, as a book on a surface. So I guess there is something quite a lot that is lost when we quickly move from textual practice to social diagnosis, if that makes sense. And conversely, sustained attention to the sign will allow for a more rigorous and ethically grounded engagement of the issue. I think so.
No, and I agree, and I know you like that. You told me as much, and so when I think about reading as a practice, I think of it very much sort of as, for the lack of a better word, analogous somehow to a sort of interpersonal engagement, and that is where a question of ethics becomes important. And this is something that we've talked about increasingly across various fora now. I mean, here with Narrating Difference and the kind of events we've had, even with comparatists in conversation, this has come up. And so it's not about the policing of a reading, or in that sense the morality of a reading, because that's a sort of morality is a matter of social contract, consensus, larger sort of what maybe comes close to what Appadurai would call the vertebrate. And I do think that reading happens on a more sort of cellular and interpersonal level. And so this relationship with the text is where we're engaging with the sign. The symptomatic or the diagnostic then becomes everything that's sort of, I'm not saying extraneous in the sense that extraneous as meaningless, but in terms of everything that surrounds it. And so especially, and this kind of harks back to your session as well, Chinmay, when you were reading Can the Subaltern Speak? And one of the things that I find very telling in that text is that moment where Spivak says, what happens to, signifiers when they are allowed to run amok, when they're left to their own devices. And so what she's trying to then kind of unpack is this very strange moment where the differentiation between the sign and the signifier are kind of collapsed, and there is just this body that exists. And so when we think about this sort of symptomatic reading, of course, it is useful in a certain sense in terms of understanding history, context, but those are still things that help us make sense of the text as opposed to, making sense in and of themselves. Again, going back to a class with Pratap Bandyopadhyay, he had a very beautiful way of explaining the relationship between the various components of what creates rasa in nataka or in a poetic moment, and the bhava, vibhava, anubhava, vyabhichari bhava, and so on and so forth. And the example he would use is that Dushyant sees Shakuntala in the most ideal setting possible, right? I mean, the weather is pleasant. There's a water body. There are forest animals frolicking around, and that kind of is conducive to falling in love. And so that is what we feel as readers. All of these sort of external factors then come together in that moment to create that experience. And so he would ask that, if it were in a different setting, like, for example, if it were like 46 degrees as it is outside in Delhi in the afternoons right now, and it was hot and sunny and humid and sweltering, and there wasn't a sign of shade anywhere. And, Dushyant was hot and sweaty and tired, and he saw Shakuntala, who's also hot and sweaty and tired. In that moment, would they have fallen in love? So, so I think that's a very sort of interesting sort of distinction to make, that there are all of these things that help us make meaning, but they are meaningful in sort of conjunction with one another.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that exactly answers what you were trying to ask. But yeah.
No, yeah, and I guess what I'd like to add is that the way sometimes I deal with this, and this is still a problem, because the allure of the symptomatic reading is always there, because I've been taught a certain way earlier. But one of the moves that I like doing is to read the intentionality of the author as it is given to us in the performativity of the text, right? And intentionality not being intention that I intend to lift this bottle, or but to be conscious of. So very quickly to give an example would be to say that, well, I know Toni Morrison was conscious of race, because that sort of thing. I know or any romance writer is conscious of romance. And so to have that approach or that attitude towards a thing in life, but that to read that only as it is given to me in the performativity of the text, which then I appropriate, right?
And if I was to do something very cheeky with that example of the Sultan's elephant that I gave, and if we think of all of these sort of, blind men who go to kind of see the elephant, and if we think of how they kind of, they only feel parts of the elephant, and they come back, oh, the elephant is like a giant tree trunk, the elephant is like a wall. And if we think of these people as, committed, theoretically minded people who are singularly committed to one theory, so of course they will see only one aspect of that text. So if the elephant is the text, then theory becomes the sort of poking around in the dark way of reading. That's just me being facetious.
Yeah. Well, also I just wanted to check with Shachi how much time we still have for this.
I think 8 to 10 more minutes we can go, and then we'll open to the questions. Also, if meanwhile this conversation, if you have questions, you can start typing in the chat box, so we can maybe also bring those questions during the conversation.
Yeah, and as we're sort of ending this discussion between Satish and I and opening this up to with all of you, so we really appreciate that. And I guess then we could sort of end with that afterword of yours. What does it mean to be a comparative, to lead a comparative life or a grievable life? a recent conversation with a friend. She was working on how certain bodies are grievable and certain bodies aren't, and that the state creates spaces of exclusion coming from an Agamben sort of thing, and then in that space of exclusion, state of exception, sorry, not exclusion, but exception, bare life is made, and that is not, well, that's just bare life. Can't grieve it. Sorry, you know. So maybe you'd want to address that, because there are those Agamben strains in your writing as well.
I mean, yes, in as much as I did read Agamben at a young and impressionable age. So yes, but also I think, and I don't think that this is what is Agamben's sort of thesis, or this is what Agamben is saying. And I agree with the proposition that theorists or thinkers need to be saved not from themselves, but more so from their lobbyists or from their staunch supporters. And so Marx needs to be saved from the Marxists, and Derrida needs to be saved from the Derridians, and so on and so forth. But the question that I was trying to work through was something that comes up in a lot of writings by comparatists, particularly American comparatists who think of comparative literature as an immigrant discipline, and then also think about this practice as a practice that works with or tries to understand the intelligibility of grief. And so, does then thinking comparatively help us? I don't know. Of course, I mean, there is that whole thing that, Susan Sontag says, that the modern condition is marked by an unprecedented call to bear witness to the suffering of others, to the pain of others. And it's how we respond to that pain. And that's something that I talk about, particularly in the fourth chapter as well, when we're thinking of these sort of global solidarities of the otherwise than. And does the solidarity then erase the difference? Do we have to erase difference in order to express solidarity, or can we think of solidarity in different ways? And so when I'm thinking about the idea of comparative lives and grievable lives, I'm also thinking about the intelligibility of grief. And so, which is why I use the example of that story by Temsola Au. And all right, so maybe I'll just go ahead and read a bit from that. So the story is titled "The Platform" and is a part of her last published short story collection, "The Tombstone in My Garden." The piece reflects on the nature of outsiderhood within the context of Nagaland, a state that in many ways has itself inhabited the margins of our nationhood and national imaginaries. The narrative is focalized through the figure of Nandu, a porter who starts working on the platforms of the Dimapur train station in the 1960s. He is referred to as Bihari, a term used for most migrant workers in Dimapur at the time, often regardless of which part of India they came from. As the years roll by, Nandu becomes increasingly aware of a new kind of outsider called the Bangladeshi, whose presence becomes increasingly unsettling in Dimapur. It is not the natives who are quite as troubled by the rising ranks of these new outsiders, the narrator tells us, but rather other groups of outsiders who, unlike the Bihari or the Bangladeshi, had established stakes in the macroeconomies of Nagaland. The story subtly alludes to the ensuing refugee crisis from the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, when Nandu ends up fostering an orphaned refugee boy he finds cowering in the corner of the Dimapur train station. Nandu tries and fails to get the boy to wash and clean himself, who seemed to be in a shock-induced stupor. Taking charge of the situation, Nandu decides to bathe the boy and discovers that the boy was Muslim. Panic rises in Nandu, and resolving not to abandon the child he had rescued, he keeps impressing upon the boy that his name is now Ajay. The boy, gradually emerging from a long torpor, finally speaks. Amar Naam Ajmal. Nandu's panic intensifies and he shouts at the boy. The frightened boy concedes, and in the years that follow, Nandu goes to great lengths to conceal the boy's true identity and raises Ojoy as his adopted son. As Ojoy grows up, tensions around the increasingly visible presence of the newer, unwelcomed outsiders rise. But Nandu is able to shield his adopted son from being discovered as a Bangladeshi and a Muslim. However, through a cruel turn of events, Ajay's true identity is discovered. Nandu is unaware of this and starts to worry when Ajay does not return home from work that evening. He later learns that a naked corpse was found hanging by a dhoti near the train station. The face had been badly disfigured, but given the corpse's nakedness, it had been identified as Muslim. Nandu instantly knew the corpse was Ojay's. I am thinking of past and present comparative lives invoked in my introduction to this book. I am thinking of the illustrious Paul Hazard and the polyglot polymath George Steiner, while simultaneously thinking of the image of an unnamed naked corpse that concludes Temsula Au's short story. I am thinking of Claudio Guillen's sense of a simultaneous habitation across multiple dwellings, in stark contrast to the ever growing numbers of the deracinated, despoiled, and dead, both globally and closer to home. I'm thinking of Ojoy, who was once Ajmal, an outsider sheltered and nurtured by yet another outsider. I'm thinking of a defaced hanging corpse whose name everybody knew and also knew not to utter. I am thinking of whether Ojoy, who was once Ajmal, whose parents were killed in a riot, a traumatized child refugee who was a less acceptable outsider, cared for and loved by another slightly more acceptable outsider, who probably spoke, thought, and lived in at least three languages, an orphan, a refugee, a beloved child, who ended up as an unnamed corpse hanging near the Dimapur train station, silently recognized by his adoptive father. I am wondering whether his life too counts as a comparative life.
Thank you. Very powerful ending. Also ending with a corpse. Um, so I guess with that we could open this up to questions. Shachi.
Yes, yes. Please feel free to raise your hands or type your questions in the chat box. Um, I also have a question. First of all, thank you so much. The whole discussion took me back to our complete classes. I'm still a complete scholar, but those classes don't happen anymore. So it's some stuff that I recall from there, and some of it you have already answered. But so in your first section, you were talking about temporality and the existence of different um, you were talking about songs from different periods together, that you grew up listening to all of those songs from different time periods. And in fact, when we are talking about literature, music, or any kind of art, it will be, it's what we have read, it's an imitation of life. So some material, some substance of it, or what we have studied as the stuff, the raw material of it will be there wherever you read it. And these aspects of intertextuality, interliterariness, how they are also brought in this discussion of temporality, because texts are not, obviously they are read in different timelines, but then also they are written again. They are written in different forms. So some idea of those texts are still carried across. And then I'm not sure how exactly to put it yet. I'm just thinking about it. But in third section, then we were discussing the reader's position or the frame that we are reading the text with. So that is a question about reading, and but still, how do you connect these two things when the raw, the stuff material of text that is present, the intertextual aspect, and then our reading from a certain position or certain time frame that we are coming across the text in. So just something more you would like to add on that?
And I think, like I said, I think of this as analogous to an interpersonal interaction, right? So, and in that sense, the only thing we have with which to approach the text is ourselves and our lived experiences, but also to then understand that we are going to be changed by this. We are going to, you know, our horizons are going to be broadened in certain ways. We are going to be forced to think in ways or think about things that we did not think possible. Now, Chinmay brought up the example of Toni Morrison, and of course, one of the texts that is most widely read is is Beloved, and I've taught it multiple times now as well. And of course, we're never going to understand the experience of a character like Seth. We're never going to understand it because A, it's not about us. We did not live in that time period. And God forbid we have to ever live in a reality where that becomes something that we have to contend with. And one of the most disturbing realizations that we have to contend with is the recognition that what Sether does, the act of killing her child, is an act of love. And there's nothing that, again, there's nothing in our lived experiences that has prepared us to encounter that, to bear witness to that. But that is precisely the point. Now, if I were to share something very sort of personal here in terms of not something that takes me closer to understanding it, but something that caused me to reflect upon what I was reading much later. When my grandmother was admitted to the hospital the last time before she passed away, and we were confronted with the question of end of life care. Now, that is something that we all struggle with, my family and I struggled with, because in our minds, or at least in our understanding, to care was to keep alive. But then to contend with the realization that keeping alive does not actually mean caring, in the sense that that's not something that is keeping the person comfortable or is keeping the person from pain and harm. And even after that, it's not something that I will ever be able to say that, oh, I can now understand what Setha felt. And yet there is something human that resonates across these experiences. I will never understand the choice Setha had to make. And yet, when I read that book again after my grandmother's passing, that was something that I couldn't help think about. Again, not to make the book about myself, but to then think of what I have to take with me to the book. And of course, I'm going to be challenged to think in ways that I have not thought before. I'm going to have to think about demands that this sort of interpersonal relationship can make upon me. And that is true for a text, that's also true for a person. So, in that sense, we are always kind of trying to reconcile and maybe even failing to reconcile, because that's not the purpose of reading. So, that's the way I think about what it means for me to be a reader.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful answer to this. Do we have any more questions? You can raise your hands.
Maybe until someone interrupts me with a question, maybe I can just keep this conversation going, if that's okay. But please feel free to interrupt. There we go. Perfect.
Somebody raised a hand.
Yes.
Excuse me. I'm so sorry. I'm from Indonesia.
Yes.
Can I just ask question? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's really like interesting one to listen to you all. I miss Hyderabad a lot. I was there. Yeah. So I just catch the idea about morality is social contract. You mentioned that, Satish Kumar, right? It just remind me to one novel from Indonesia, which is which is the title is Shackles, written by one famous author from Indonesia, which is Armin Pane. Shackle is,
So
from your explanation of,
could you put the name
yeah.
in the chat box? That way we would know.
Oh yeah.
Thank you. But go ahead, please.
It is, yeah. So my question is, I'm not really know about what the things you actually explain. I just catch some parts, some points. Yeah. So if I say, for example, modern identity is the clash between personal desire and versus social society expectation. Is that okay? Like, for example, so I can say that society itself is a circles, right? What do you think? I hope you can understand my question is, yeah.
I would say that it depends on where you're saying that from. Right? Sense that when we think, and we can think about the modern in a variety of different ways. I mean, we can think of it as a prison, or we can think of it as liberating.
Okay.
But it would depend on the context, right? Again, I'm going back to that example of things fall apart, which I'd mentioned earlier. That and we're told that the first sort of wave of people who converted to Christianity upon the arrival of the colonizers and the missionaries were people who were already sort of at the margins of the social structure in that space. People who had twins, for example, because it was customary that twins would be left to die in the forest because twins were considered an abomination against the earth. People who did not have titles in the clan, who were not, important people in the clan, who could not climb the quote unquote social ladder. For them, of course, the coming of the missionaries was in many ways liberating. Similarly, we can see several examples of how colonial culture has been thought of as liberating in so many different contexts. But then that is also the kind of PR stunt that European colonization pulled. That we are on a civilizing mission. We are trying to make people you know uh, people's lives better. Look, we're giving you railways, we're giving you modern medicine. So I think it would depend on where that inference or that assertion is coming from.
I see. Yeah. So it's depend on the context like that or the text itself?
I would
I
say
mean,
the context. Yeah.
okay. So like it can be how to say, liberating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you a lot. Yeah.
And please
Nice.
share the name of
Yeah.
the novel and the author if you can.
Yes. Sure. Yeah.
We also have a question in the chat box. Should I read it out?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So Nirmal says, haven't read the book, but really enjoyed the discussion. I was interested by and wanted to hear some more about the ritual versus theatre section that you had talked about. You mentioned G. Sankara Pillai, if I'm not wrong, idea that ritual loses its meaning when transplanted into the proscenium. But now that the proscenium isn't the only way we can imagine theatre, site specific environmental theatres, I was wondering if performance could draw from ritual without emptying it out.
As far as G. Shankaram Pillai's work is concerned and the way he looked at it, he would say no. He would say no, that every time ritual is restaged, ritual is being restaged or being repurposed for performative purposes, it is emptied of meaning. But I'm curious to also maybe understand what context you are speaking of, because G. Shankaram Pillai is talking about the appropriation of certain ritual acts like the lighting of a lamp, the using of half curtains, the using of these sort of ritual devices or practices in other forms of theater like Kutiyatam or Kathakali, and how they are restaged in a proscenium format just as a spectacle. So that is the context that G. Shankaram Pillai is speaking from. So is there a specific context that you're speaking from, Nirmal? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm audible.
Faintly. You might have to speak up a little.
Okay. Let me let me know if at any point it's
Yeah,
not audible.
now you're loud and
Yeah,
clear.
this is perfect. Yeah.
Okay, cool. No, I was not really thinking of any specific uh, context. The question comes from something I was like working on recently, in which was working on a study of a specific site-specific play, and while analyzing it, there is the idea that Richard Schechner brings that the imagining a contiguous space comes not from ancient Greek theater or even ancient Asian theater, because they all have this kind of separation of audience and performance. But he instead draws the idea from ritual performances, where there is a more contiguous space and like free flow between what is audience and what is performer. But so that is so when I was thinking about theater and performance, I didn't know the context of like restaging performance in a recreating it for perhaps like I know a lot of places in Kerala do that for tourists. Things that were originally ritualistic performances are recreated for tourists, for either to like let performers keep their livelihoods or whatever. But I was thinking if more in like a narrative form of theater, and if definitely there could be things that draw from these ritualistic, but can we draw from that without completely emptying it of its meaning? Can we keep some of its meaning while telling a story around it?
No, and again, like that's, yeah, I think also this is something that comes up in God of Small Things, right? At the sort of like these resorts where Kathakali dancers are performing like 5-minute pieces as opposed to a full play. So no, of course those,
Yes.
yeah. So those are of course situations where of course something is being taken out of context. But if you're talking about a sort of situated practice, a sort of situated location specific kind of performance, then I think it becomes different. There is also another framework that somebody like Bole Shoinka provides, and I think the essay is called The Fourth Stage in Myth Literature in the African World, where he's trying to think about the ritual roots of performance and what that means in the context of a modern African theater as well. And so I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it would require a certain kind of mindfulness. It would require a certain kind of understanding of the place of ritual and the place of performance. And I look at that in a slightly different way, in the sense of I was looking at particularly the rituals of mourning that the Aravani perform every year, and how there is an entire corpus of LGBTQI activism that kind of forms around that ritual. But the ritual itself remains, in a certain way, untouched, but it also becomes the occasion then for all of these forms of advocacy to emerge around it. So that's one way in which I try to think about it. But no, I don't think that any sort of borrowing from ritual is a sort of appropriation that empties it of meaning. G. Shankaram Pillai, like I said, was talking about a very specific moment in the history of modern Indian theatres where, as he says, just for local flavor, you take bits of ritual performance and just throw it in to a proscenium format play, just for local flavor, just for spectacle. So I think it would work differently for located and context specific or location specific performative traditions.
Thank you for that added context.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm I was very interested in thinking about this relation between comparison and grief, that you were talking about, that despite there being a lot of differences between two experiences, say the experiences that we are reading in a literary narrative, and the reader's own experiences, there are some points of comparison which we build through the process of reading, where our own subjectivity meets the narrative or the experience that the author is describing. And it's those points of intersections which also often allow us to mourn and grieve for the people, grieve for the narratives and experiences which might not be related to us in that way. And therefore, this process of comparison and reading also building a sense of an ethics of grieving in a way. But I'm in this context, I'm also trying to thereby my question is, if there is a possibility of there being this ethics of grieving, a possibility of grieving at points and at intersection at with people where no comparison of any sorts is possible. And in this context, I was thinking of Derrida's dedication to Chris Hani in Spectres of Marx, where he's saying that, violence is metonomical, and there is some sort of relationality between racial, sexual, gendered, and other forms of violence. But at the same time, he's talking about this idea of the proper noun, that at the end of the day, an individual is an individual in itself. It's a life that is absolute in its own right, that it's not an activist, a communist, or an African American person who has been killed, but an individual themselves who has been killed, and therefore, they're also being, and therefore that question of grieving happening, if we take out these aspects of commonality or these categories where intersections happening, how do we think about grieving where there is no comparison possible? And in a slightly different context, but just sticking with Derrida, I'm also then thinking of politics of forgiveness, because we are also thinking of grieving for people in relations of those who have suffered some sort of oppression. But do we then think about a politics of forgiveness, or in question of forgiveness and grieving for those who oppress, or not, if that makes sense?
Now, forgiving oppressors, now that I don't, I find myself wholly unequipped to comment on that. But again, which is why I was talking about the intelligibility of grief, the recognition of pain, the recognition of suffering. And we may not have anything in common, but there is something that allows us to recognize a suffering subject. Right? You don't need to know the nature of the pain that another is experiencing in order to recognize the signs of pain. And what I'm saying then is that that recognition itself is something that should prompt us to act, or prompt us to act compassionately, if you want to call it that, or think empathetically. And I think also the word empathy is kind of much abused, because it gets tied up in these sort of specificities that, oh, I can't say anything because I haven't experienced this exact same pain. But that is where I think an ethical imagination becomes important, because it is through these representations that we are able to access the experiences of another. We can never inhabit them, they can never be ours, they are not about us. But we still have access to them, and that access is important. We are able to recognize them. That is important. We are able to recognize a body in pain. And that should do something to us. And again, so this is because, again, I think Toni Morrison is an author that I think a lot with, is just this willingness to be shocked and to be undone sometimes by what we're witnessing in a literary work. Because yes, there are specific ways in which specific communities, specific people are oppressed. But there is a structurality of oppression that we cannot deny. There is a way in which otherness is interpreted, a way in which difference is interpreted in order to create an other. And then it is through that discourse of differentiation that the other is then rendered violable, and therefore the violation of that other is also rendered unbelievable. Now, the mechanisms and way in which this operates is, of course, different because there are different kinds of difference that we are engaging with. Difference of gender, difference of caste, difference of race, difference of class. Right? So, of course, all of those things are different, but that structural nature of depersoning, that structural move to kind of make another body violable or permissible to be violated is a structural thing. And so if we don't understand that, then again, this, and I don't say this in a facetious way, that it's not, at the end of the day, it's not a pedagogy of the oppressed that helps us, but a pedagogy of oppression that helps us understand how this works. Because if we are not able to understand the structurality of it through all of these different pedagogies of the oppressed, all of these discursive representations of oppression, then we've missed the point. And I know that doesn't answer the second part of your question, but
No, that's fine. I think the primary question was the first one, but I think somewhere in the chain of thinking, that relationality of griefs and ethics and violence also led me to think about that, and which is why I think at least the last statement answers it, because in some ways that Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed was also somewhere, I think, looming at the back of my mind as well, because he's also then talking about this very relationality of the oppressors and the oppressed, and this question of forgiveness, or thinking about the oppressed also taking away both the oppressor and the oppressed outside this chain of violence that happens. So I think the last statement does help address, at least in to large part, the second question as well.
I think we have something in the chat box, and then Shomadi raised her hand and left.
We have the name of the book in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but then Shomadi raised her hand and then left.
Yeah.
Maybe we can have someone else by the time she rejoins. Any more questions? Any comments? Anything you are just thinking about?
Something at some point in the beginning.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Satish. What is?
I said, didn't Ikshitadi want to say something towards the beginning?
Ikshita ma'am. Okay, Smita has a question.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. My question is sort of related to what Nirmal was asking. Now, I'm not a theatre studies person at all, so the vocabulary and its theoretical weightage, I know that term is probably inappropriate in this discussion, but I'm unfamiliar with it. But this is just something that I was thinking about this idea of ritual as a whole that can or cannot be transported into performance. And I understand a whole as involving various elements, space, temporally, what follows it, what precedes it, who is there to watch it, who is there to enact it, and ritual as a whole that is made up of all of these elements. Now, I'm not saying that these elements aren't relevant, but I wonder if there is a set relation in between them in a holistic sense that makes it a ritual, which if not sustained in performance, it loses its meaning, if that makes sense. I'm asking whether these elements can have differing relations with other elements in other contexts, some of those elements being elements of spectacle, and could still be called ritual. That would give ritual a dynamic sense, or is the dynamic sense antithetical to ritual itself? So again, just to finish up my question, to end on a sort of a provocative note, but like I know this discussion, I'm also from Kerala, so this discussion about, sorry, a fire alarm just went off in my student accommodation.
I think it was a very provocative question.
Yeah, is everything all right?
No, this is the problems of the West, as
It's
you know.
a drill. It's a drill. I think it's done.
Okay, all right.
I'm back. Yeah. So no, because I'm also from Kerala and I'm I'm aware of like the.
It's not actually.
Yeah.
So it's ludic. It's not actually happening.
Yeah. Because I'm aware of wait. It's going off again. Sorry about this.
Yeah. No. Scary.
Okay. I think
Yes.
something is burning down. Okay. I'm aware of like the conversations about Kudiyattam and Kathakali being performed for tourists and resorts and all that.
Yeah.
But I wonder, the presence of ritualistic elements in those kind of performances can be read as adding local flavor for commercial purposes and all, but can't it simultaneously be rituals if we understand ritual also as relational? Like, can we say that the diverse population who watch it and the performers who perform it don't relate to use your term, signs involved in performance as ritual? So ritual as relational. So where do we draw this line between ritual and performance? Because for me, that line can only be drawn if we understand ritual in a static, holistic sense that would have to be entirely transported into performance.
And again, I mean, at least for the purposes of my argument in the book, and it's not really about distinguishing between ritual as, something quote unquote indigenous and theater as a modern performative medium. But what G. Shankaram Pillai is arguing is that the difference, as you said, is intention. Now, of course, there is spectacle in ritual performance as well. But the intention with which it is situated in ritual, at least that is what G. Shankaram Pillai is arguing, the way in which it is situated in the context of ritual, the intention behind situating it there is different from that of a performative context for him, which is, again, modern proscenium theatre. So outside of that, I'm sure it can be both. But it then again has to do with intention. Right? And I brought up the example of Wole Soyinka and what basically things that he argues in that essay, Fourth Stage. And if we think about the way in which he reinterprets or restages the Bacchae of Euripides, it ends in what he calls a sort of communion rite. It is, everybody is bathed in the blood of Pentheus, and everybody just, is transported into this sort of trance-like state. And he calls that a sort of communion rite at the end. So, of course, the ways in which these elements are reimagined and used outside the context of ritual situate them differently. But as far as the difference between ritual and performance is concerned, at least the way I understand it from what G. Shankaram Pillai argues, is just that it is a difference of intention. The intention is markedly different in the context of performance and in the context of ritual.
Thank you. But if I could take another minute to just push the conversation a bit further. I agree on the intention bit, but I worry and I wonder whether understanding intention in the singular and understanding intention as determined would make us sort of vulnerable to just using intention as a synonym to theory, where intention then becomes vulnerable to all the criticisms of theory that we've been talking about. It's a different term, but if we understand intention in the singular as determinative and as already sort of determined in our relation with a performance or a text, I wonder if we are just replacing the term without changing our issue with the concept to begin with.
So again, in the context of ritual, I don't think intention is singular per se. It is collective, and it is a coming together of these different things that, of course, the participants in that ritual are getting out of it. And everybody is getting perhaps the same thing or something different. It's difficult to tell. And honestly, if I'm being absolutely clear, I don't know. Right. So in the sense that, is that intention singular? Is the performer's intention what that which guides the ritual? I'm not entirely sure. But it is at least something where all of these different participants in the ritual are coming together with a sort of understanding that there is something meaningful in this act. And whatever meaning they derive from it, and of course, Jishankaran Pillai is talking about it in the context of the ethos of bhakti, in the sense that everybody over there receives something from the ritual that is uniquely theirs, but they are all united in the intention of receiving something or getting something out of that ritual.
Yes, thank you. That makes sense. And I apologize for the fire alarm going off in the middle of this. I was not expecting.
Yeah, no, I mean, if this is done, then I don't have anything to say. I was just going to offer that maybe I could read out that one particular paragraph that might clarify these terms. But I don't think that's necessary anymore.
Can, if you still want to.
Sure,
I'm afraid we are short of time also. So let me just once more ask if there are any questions. If not, then maybe we can finish this off with the reading, the bit that you wanted. I didn't see anything in the chat box. Shoma ma'am is also not here. Yeah.
Was her hand went up and then she left.
Yeah.
I think she was trying to leave and accidentally raised her hand.
Wait. Okay, so then I think Chinmay, go ahead.
It's just a quick paragraph. It says, so this is on page 45 of Satish's book, where they write, in Pillai's schema, theatre and ritual share a certain structural similarity in their use of performance and spectacle. So this is clearly dealing with these two particular terms, performance and spectacle. So the primary difference between the two realms of performativity arises on a hermeneutic level. And this difference has to do with the functions of the performer and the audience in both these realms. So what I understand from this is the performer and the audience in theater, and the performer and the audience in ritual, different. So Pillai contextualizes this difference in his experiences of both forms of performance in southern India. Addressing the role of spectacle in both realms of performance, ritual and theater, Pillai explains that in theater, the spectacle is on display. That is the only purpose spectacle plays in theater. In the realm of ritual, however, the spectacle serves a different aim that changes not only the roles of the audience and performer, but also the hermeneutic affect of the spectacle as performative act. So as Pillai observes, the spectacle in ritual has no entity or being of its own. Similarly, the role of the performer in ritual is also different from that of the performer in theater. The performer in ritual is not representing, but is just being. And the stress on being is crucial in this context because of the seeming indistinguishability of ritual and performance and theater in Southern Indian performance traditions such as Kudiyattam and Kathakali. Both dramatic forms draw on shared mythic narratives like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as do many forms of theater and ritual performances across India. The difference between ritual and theater performances then can be made based on the difference between becoming and being. So that, I guess, would be where we can locate intention, right? Or the coming of being of intention, maybe, if that.
Okay, so I think that's it for today. I would like to end this with a vote of thanks to both Chinmay and Satish for introducing us to this wonderful book. Thank you so much, Satish. It was a wonderful talk, and thank you, Chinmay, for facilitating the discussion. We really enjoyed it, and I'm sure all of us are looking forward to reading your book. Thanks again. Okay, Smita has something to say.
No, ignore me. Ignore it. It's just for that.
Okay, maybe you can take this discussion outside the meeting later. Okay, thanks again. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you in our next session.